This is the story of the Native Americans. So, to start off, they came across this little ice sheet, and this is called the Beringia theory, and this connected Siberia and North America. And basically, they got to the Americas, and it was like really, really freezing. So then they went like down south, where it was sunny, and like lots of crops grew, and everyone was happy, right? And then all was going well until these dudes came on their ships, and it was the Europeans. And the Europeans brought disease, they brought slaughter, and they brought a destruction of culture, which was like the mestizos. And so the mestizos were a population that was created as a mix of European and native blood. And this contributed to the racial class system that consisted with the peninsulares, which were the people born in Spain. They were at the top, and the Native Americans down at the bottom. The mestizos and mulattoes, they'd be right there in the middle. The Creoles would be right above them. And this racial division really caused a lot of conflict to arise in those areas. And the main goals and objectives of these colonists were religion, gold, and trade. This was navigated by Portugal, Spain, France, England, and even the Dutch. And here's some colonists. And the main colony groups were the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. And they were each very, very special. Now, all of the regions in the early colonies, they all had some sort of democratic government institution. And in the southern colonies, it was actually the Virginia House of Burgesses. And what this was this is like an assembly. And even though it was typically higher class people, it still had that principle of like representation. So if someone in this area of Virginia would say, hey, there's an issue with this, like a port or a river, we need to fix this, he would be able to represent that area. And it allowed for also the dispute of beliefs. There was not that one unilateral belief that someone across the ocean in England could dictate everything. Now people could say, hey, I think we should do this. No, I think we should do this. So it really set up that founding principle. And the middle colonies was actually ruled by the Quaker elite. And what this was the Quakers were that group of people that were just accepting of everyone. The frame of government of Pennsylvania was written by William Penn. He's a Quaker. And basically it just guaranteed a ton of rights, like trial by jury, freedom of religion. And religion, the religious tolerance was like really, really big in Pennsylvania. So the middle colonies really set up that more free, like, power to the people sort of thing. And in the New England colonies, the Pilgrims actually arrived in Plymouth, and there was no government there. So they wrote the Mayflower Compact, which was the first actual, like, constitution or like a governing document. And but the only problem was that in that area, it was they all were leaving because of religious persecution. So they were like really strong Puritans, and because of that, they enforced a lot of their religion through their rules of government, and this caused no separation of church and state. Later on, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were written, and it was like the first actual constitution. The Mayflower Compact was more of just a governing document. Meanwhile, the Orders of Connecticut were like an actual constitution. And then we've got culture. The early colonies' culture was actually really distinct, and it was because there was such a high sense of community. It was like everyone was connected. Like your neighbors would be your family in a sense. There was like a high communal belief that someone over here would work with someone over here in order to better their community, and if someone over here does something wrong, they would get exposed for it. And the church was that major institution that connected everyone. And although it wasn't consistent throughout all the colonies, it was pretty heavily, it was a huge influence. And the colonies were also very patriarchal, which meant that the males really dominated the society. Women were oppressed, their rights were kind of limited, and this led to a cult of domesticity, which was like the belief that women should stay in the household, that they should, that the fathers would do all the economic gain, and then the mothers would care for the children. Religion? So the religion in early colonies was really, really interesting. So in the southern colonies, they actually were mostly Anglican, so they were Protestant. And the Maryland Toleration Act allowed that Catholic safe haven in a sense, so that anyone who wasn't really Protestant in the South could go up there and express their faith. And the major impact that this had was that since the South was such a slave laden area, a lot of the slaves started connecting Christianity to a lot of the things that they did. So like the sorrow songs and stuff like that, a lot of it would have Christian faith. And the middle colonies, they were extremely, extremely tolerant. This was led by the Quakers, as mentioned before. They had a friendly relationship with the natives, and they were all pacifists. They didn't like violence. They really, they believed that religious tolerance would lead to a more diverse population, and that would be beneficial towards their society. Now, in the New England colonies, there was absolutely no tolerance. They were all Puritans. People like Anne Hutchinson would get banished. Roger Williams, he founded Rhode Island. They would get banished if they didn't conform with Puritan beliefs. And John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill speech really kind of like reinforced that standard. Moving on to the economy. So each of the colonies' economies depended on where they geographically were. So the New England colonies were up north, so it was cold, so year-round agriculture wasn't doing too well, and the soil was really rocky, so it wasn't that fertile. And because of their urban social structure, the slaves and indentured servants, they didn't really need them for much of their economic production. A lot of it was based on manufacturing and just producing or taking the raw materials, making it into something, and sending it back to the mother colony, which would be Great Britain. And a lot of this was also fishing and whaling, and then just lumber, because it's like forestry. In the middle colonies, it was a warm climate. They were called the breadbasket because they produced the majority of the agriculture. The land was extremely fertile. It would be almost year-round, and then they also did trade a bit of fur using the ports and rivers. In the southern colonies, it was hot all year round, and because of this necessity for labor, slaves and indentured service were huge parts of this economy. Cash crops like tobacco on John Rolfe's Jamestown. There was rice, indigo, and then cotton became really popular as well. And this caused a major wealth gap because there were a lot of landless whites and small farmers, and then the plantation owners and like the elites were really high up. The Middle Passage. And to understand the Middle Passage, you have to understand the concept of triangular trade. And basically what this was that Great Britain is this mother country, right? And the whole point of having these colonies was to expand their empire. They wanted a bigger economy. They wanted more control, more power. And the triangular trade did so. Basically what happened was all the colonists in America, they'd send over their resources, whether this is food, gold, silver, whatnot. They would take these resources once they got to Europe, and they would manufacture them, and then send these manufactured goods down to Africa. And in return, they'd get slaves, but instead of taking them back up to England, where they don't really need them, they would send them to the Americas. And this whole trade really helped Great Britain, but harmed these other two parties. And the Middle Passage was from Africa to North America, and that's where 20% of slaves actually died. The ships were structured with these little, the decks, they were very poorly structured. So there weren't very many windows. A lot of the slaves died due to disease and dysentery, and it was horrible. And because of this, it caused a lot of mass enslavement. There were tons of conflicts. Now, the early colonies experienced a lot of conflict, and this was typically due to land disputes or treaties being broken. And the latter is probably the more significant one, because a lot of the colonists would be like, yeah, we're going to be peaceful with your tribe, and then literally 1 month later, they'll be like carrying out an attack. And it was extremely problematic because the natives, they're not just not going to fight back. And so the first set were the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, and this was between 1610 to 1646. And at first there were friendly relations. It kind of went back and forth throughout this 36-year period of time. And it was in Jamestown, surrounded by the Powhatan tribe, and it was John Rolfe and Pocahontas were like the main story. There's also Smith and Pocahontas, which had like no one knows if he lied or not, but like there were a few stories about that. And there was a peace treaty set in 1646, which established the boundaries that would not be crossed unless it was for economic or business purposes. And yeah, the next one was the Bacon's Rebellion. And this was when Nathaniel Bacon and a lot of other farmers, they got mad that native attacked on the frontiers. And basically what happened was, in these areas, it would be like the city center, or like the town center, and then like the farms, and then like this frontier area, and then the tribes. And this frontier area was kind of like that in-between territory. And a lot of like the less landowners, a lot of like the not as rich people, they lived there. And they were getting kind of pissed off. And so Bacon and his militia, they attacked nearby tribes, and Berkeley said, no, don't do that. And then Bacon was like, no, I'm right. So then he marched his militia on Jamestown. And the fear of indentured servants just really, really grew with this. And then we've got the Pequot War, which was only a 3-year war, but it was a pretty bad war. It was from 1636, to 1638. And there were friendly relationships at first, and it was in the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the natives lost, and it was a brutal, brutal attack by the colonists. And we've got the King Philip's War, which really was Metacom from the Wampanoag tribe, and it was pretty mutually destructive, to say the least. Food shortages, diseases, and then casualties just destroyed the natives in this war. And so Metacom, or King Philip as the whites would call him, he was actually betrayed by his own natives. So one of the colonists said, hey, why don't you go? And he was basically a narc, and he killed King Philip, and almost 10% of colonial men died in this war. So it was a really, really brutal war. And then we've got the Iroquois Confederation, which was a result, and this was the alliance of 5 tribes in the New York region, and it just wanted to create that first setup against invasion. They wanted to say, okay, we need a contingency in a sense, and it did model for a lot of democratic principles, separation of church and state. Women were actually in this confederation, which was really significant. There were a lot of the philosophical ideas of separation of powers, checks and balances, and then there were representatives from each tribe. So it really, really modeled a foundation for democracy. Finally, colonial thoughts. And this Age of Enlightenment was the change in colonial thought. And it's said to be inspired by the Magna Carta, which was that document that challenged the king's authority and granted parliamentary sovereignty. So basically power to the people. And this sparks a lot of philosophers to break out. So we've got John Locke, who basically said you're born with these unalienable rights. They can't be taken away from you. That's it. Voltaire believed in a freedom of speech. This led to the Zenger trials, which was the media challenging authority. And then Rousseau said the government exists for the people. It should be represented by the people. The people should govern it because they're the ones that are the ones receiving the government, right? And then Montesquieu said there should be a separation of powers. If a government is one-sided, it's going to be a tyranny. It's going to be a dictatorship. It's not going to function properly. And the Glorious Revolution made Great Britain a constitutional monarchy because they passed their English Bill of Rights, which really just granted that parliamentary sovereignty that said, hey, the crown has a lot of power, but this is where all the laws are going to be made. They're just going to oversee this from now on, which still exists in the UK today and in the island of Great Britain. And the Salem witch trials went along with this because a lot of the people started to think, hey, people are there are people out there that are witches, and the consequences of this was that they would take these women, they'd say, you're a witch, they'd say, no, I'm not, they'd say, too bad, you're going to get accused, and then you're going to get convicted, and then you're going to receive some consequences, some punishments. A lot of them were killed, and clearly there were some faults in this, and spectral evidence was there later on taken out, and a judiciary was established, and because of this, it created a more reviewable justice system. It created justice, right? And so people would go to court, and they'd be like, yeah, I didn't do this. And then the court would say, okay, let me see some evidence that you did do it. And if there is no evidence, you won't be accused. And then we've got the First Great Awakening. And what this was a huge religious revival, especially among the Protestants. And a lot of the religious leaders and government leaders, they were defied by the people. And this was huge. And it led to what a lot of people say led to the American Revolution.